Welcome back to the show. We're about to learn the secret sauce. Excellent. So Ryan, thanks so much for making the drive down. Or the drive up, I guess. Technically, it's north from where you live. We don't have to dox you until, but yeah. Anyway, what I'm getting at is welcome. Looking forward to learning about your background in Solid and sort of how you got there. But before we start, do you want to intro yourself? Tell us what you do, how you got there.
What I do,
Do you have a title at Netlify?
Yeah. I mean, I am principal engineer on open source at Netlify officially.
Okay, nice.
But yeah, I created the SolidJS framework, and I work on open source full time, which is an amazing opportunity provided to me by Netlify. And that means I work a lot on my own JavaScript framework, but also interact with a lot of members in other JavaScript frameworks. And we actually do a lot of stuff together in terms of, benchmarking demos and kind of figuring out, where technology is heading.
Yeah. So this is going to be like a open-ended question, but like, where'd you learn how to code?
I've been doing this for quite some time. I started as a kid. My dad went back to school at one point, and he was like an iron worker by trade. And he came home and he was so proud to show me this white little arrow that would go up the screen on this like blue background. And it was written in Quick Basic, as I would find out later. But he was like, "Ryan, look, it's a rocket ship." And I could tell at that point, like, that it wasn't just like a video, like he'd made the computer do this. And I was pretty young at the time. And immediately I knew like I wanted to program. So I was like 10 years old and I was learning Quick Basic, trying to make my own rocket ship or video game, as it would be. But I mean, realistically, to actually do anything real, I mean, I did tinker around with trying to make games for a couple of years. But the first practical solution was I kind of got started right around the time the web got started. I was in my teens, when the kind of dawn of the internet, and I was playing in bands, and every band needed a website, and being kind of more technical into the programming stuff, I found myself making websites for my band, for other bands, even some local businesses is really kind of how I, got into, I guess, web development. Although, I mean,
was that in JavaScript?
That's what I was gonna say. At that point, there wasn't that much JavaScript, right? Like what you'd do is you'd kind of, go see what someone else was doing and copy like the HTML structure of, some big mess of nested tables. But then there'd be like, the little snippets of like, oh, how did they do that cool thing? But luckily we had view source for that.
Yes. Thank you. I don't know who introduced, was it Navigator that introduced viewing source and the browser itself?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly. I as I said, this is like 95, 96, 97. I think is when I really got into full swing with the band. So by that point, yeah, you had Netscape, which was big player, and you had Internet Explorer. But
yeah, so I mean, I got to ask, like, I need to ask about the band, because the band you eventually were playing in was called Solid as well.
Yeah, that was an interesting one.
Which also like peeped the tattoo as well.
Yeah, I know. I kind of just flickered that one. It goes this way, so it takes a little bit more to see it. But essentially, naming bands are hard. And again, this is the 90s. So we were sitting there and we're like looking around the room and we're like, how do we name our band? And, at that point, like Silverchair had come out and all this. And we were like literally looking at furniture and trying to like decide what we're going to do, like Brown Table, like just doesn't have a ring to it. And it was around Easter. And there's these chocolate Easter bunnies that are called like Mr. Solid, Mr. Crunchy, all that stuff. And essentially there was a Mr. Solid Easter bunny on the table that had been brought over by a relative. And essentially we were like, yeah, Mr. Solid. And I mean, this is kind of cheeky pop punk, kind of thing. So we saw the double entendre and we were like, yes, we're going to be called Mr. Solid. And then over time we just dropped the Mr. And
okay.
Yeah.
Just like the Facebook.
Yeah. So and it's good because that became my moniker too, right? Because I was in a punk band, your last name's that. So I became Ryan Solid at that point.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, so I kind of went down memory lane on a previous episode with Chance the Dev and talking about Screamo bands. But in the 90s when I was, I guess I'm a little bit younger than you. I was like middle school.
Right.
I was also listening to a lot of like punk tapes that we would just get from random friends in the neighborhood. And I ended up like you'd mentioned before we hit record, like bands like Rancid. Like I listened to Rancid, listened to a lot of ska music and stuff like that growing up.
Yeah.
Also had a punk band. Was not very good. We didn't get out of the garage, but we ended up calling it Chicken.
Okay.
Chicken because my grandma, who's from the Caribbean, the way she pronounces chicken was chicken. And it was just...
Naming is hard. And the funny thing is, you think having learned that lesson so young, I wouldn't have really continued into programming, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like naming. So I work for a company which has got pizza in the TLD.
Yeah.
So, but that was also like it was punny to say opensauce.pizza. So like that's why we have the TLD today.
Right.
And but naming is hard. And what I usually do is I also throw out the worst name possible. So like whenever I'm on a team, like, oh, we have a new library, we have a new file, whatever, we're going to name it something. What I've learned, if you throw out the worst name, someone will come up with something better. The problem is sometimes people don't come up with something better. And then you have like what the original API for our open source, I called it Flava Flav. And up until last week, it was still called Flava Flav for the repo itself. And we ended up changing that.
Yeah, that's the thing. When you started that part of the story, I was like positive you were going to go there because you hope. It's like a 70% chance someone will get maybe 80% someone will come up with something better. But that last 20%, then you get stuck with it for a very long time. And honestly, with the Easter Bunny, for me, I felt the same way. Like I was not stoked on the name initially. And I have to admit, it grew on me over time, and obviously solid means different things to different people. And I've kept with it. When I got around to naming my JavaScript framework, I also went there. Similar thing. I was like looking on NPM and GitHub and being like, God, every possible thing is taken. And then like, I found this, like one variation, like SolidJS. I'm like, oh, that's not taken. I'll go with that. It's familiar. It's funny. It was nothing to do with the OOP kind of like thing. I was just like solid as in like the way you use it colloquially. Like, that's solid.
Yeah. I mean, it is pretty solid, and we'll get into the framework in a moment. But so you played in bands. You didn't go to school for computer science. You just sort of just a tinkerer.
Well, actually, I did try to go to school. I was in university in British Columbia, from Canada, as mentioned. But 2 years in, I was like, it was getting too busy with me with the bands and stuff. I was spending all my time with the music, so I actually left school. And we at the time, I don't know if people know Loverboy or whatnot, but this kind of 80s band that had some success, Working for the Weekend. The singer actually produced our punk rock album, surprisingly. I was taking it pretty seriously. I thought we could get signed by majors and all that. So I kind of like had left school and to do that. So I did eventually go back, but it was much later when I had already started working in the industry a bit, and it was kind of more for me that time because it kind of bugged me that I never finished rather than anything else. Because I, as I was saying, I was already working by that time.
So did you get your degree then?
Yes. Okay. I got my engineering degree, and in Canada we get this metal ring.
That's right, the ring. Yeah. Which is like, could you explain the lore to that? Because like we do have some folks that are not.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's an iron ring, and it had to do with a bridge that collapsed in Canada. It was built of iron, and the whole idea is that like you have a responsibility as an engineer to make a quality product, and this is kind of like a memorial to the people who died in the whole situation.
Yeah.
And that engineering is a place where quality is important and responsibility is part of what we do.
Yeah. So everyone who gets a degree, there's a ceremony, and you get the sort of iron ring to represent your engineering.
Yeah.
Like going through that process of getting an engineering degree.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I didn't know this until I worked at GitHub. One of the engineers went to school up in Montreal, and then she was explaining the ring. We were at a conference, actually RailsConf, and someone asked about the ring. And like, what is the ring? And then she also shared that thing. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. But also, I wish I went to school and got my engineering degree in Canada.
Yeah, no, it's good experience overall. But as I said, for me, when I went back, it was mostly for me. I wanted to do this. I around the time that the music kind of wasn't going where I was hoping. I was working in a record store. I was that was my day job. I was selling records. I was like, it was kind of depressing almost. I was like, knew I wanted to do more. So I started, shipping my little demos around. I'd been making video game demos anyways. And a company which was in Vancouver, but actually originally, I guess, a San Fran company, Active Network. They took me on, and I got reintroduced to web dev because it was basically it was a Microsoft.NET kind of place, and I worked there for 6 years. And while I don't have fond memories of .NET, right before I left the last project that I worked on, they introduced me to Knockout.js, which was it was kind of came out of Microsoft too. Steve Sanderson.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he was there when it got created, but essentially, it was very common in Microsoft shops to have Knockout. And Steve Sanderson is also involved with like Blazor.
Okay, yeah.
So and essentially, so I learned Knockout, and that actually helped me get my first kind of like fully JavaScript job at a startup of all things, where I by chance got hired by the creator of Knockback, which was a backbone knockout hybrid library, which in its day was fine. Like back in 2010 or 12 or whatever that was, it had like over 1,000 stars on GitHub. Like it was a thing.
That's pretty legit.
I'd heard of it before I joined the company. I didn't know he had actually written it though. So like in the interview, I was like comparing stuff and talking about Ember and talking about like different stuff that I kind of played with, and might have even dissed the framework a bit and not even realized it. And then like a weekend, I'm like, oh, it's the same guy. Oh, wow. But it was a really good experience to me, because he was big about Linux mentality and open source. He'd open sourced his library, Knockback. I might have said that improperly a minute ago.
Yeah.
He had open sourced his library, and we built our own ORM as well, backbone ORM. And basically the whole startup was built on open source software that had been built inside the startup, which is kind of crazy in hindsight. You might not want to do that as your startup. There's that thing about like innovation tokens or whatever people talk about. But this is like 2012, and we're like full stack JavaScript. And I will say this for that setup, I never felt so productive as that point when we were using just like everything was JavaScript. Everything was like the same APIs. We could use Backbone on the client and the server. It was like all, tied together, and it was like very powerful. And the whole team was all JavaScript engineers. And like to that point, it was kind of unheard of, this is only something that became capable.
Yeah. Do you feel like we're returning back to, sorry, I'm taking a pause into your origin story, because we'll get to eventually making Solid and where that's going. But I've been messing around with TRPC, and I haven't been back to that sort of the world of like JavaScript everywhere until just now. Like I just built a quick demo app. I'm doing a talk on TRPC pretty soon, which is why I just wanted to like go through and understand it. But it also feels like that world again, where I don't have to do all these weird like connections and like TypeScript magic. It just works.
Yeah, and to be fair, stuff like GraphQL is also in that same kind of category. And this is the time I was telling you, we built this because GraphQL didn't exist. It was kind of like the same kind of hope that we could do this. I will say this, it is very powerful, really, with this whole kind of almost monolithic, but like tied together front end to back end. We had the hardest time actually removing that like 6 years later, like when we wanted to change it, because we used like it was too coupled. I mean, if I tacked it again now, I have some more ideas. I think there's ways that you can have better contracts, like using TypeScript as your contract rather than other mechanisms that are so tied together. But yeah, it was a good thing for productivity for a small team, and I think that's why you find startups and stuff like really going towards things like TRPC. I think it's really powerful. For us having to also be the ones maintaining it, that was its own challenge. And I managed to pull it all the way back around again. Yeah. The creator ended up kind of like, it was a lot, and he ended up leaving. I don't know if it was burnout exactly, but he'd done enough, right? Yeah. And I was kind of left. I was kind of an intermediate dev at that point. I was left kind of in charge. And suddenly I was, had all these open source libraries that we're doing. And I have to admit, I was kind of the begrudgingly person. I'd worked at Microsoft shop. So when, I'd come and hit a bug, I'd like complain. And the guy would be like, yeah, there's this bug. And he's like, yeah. I'm like, where's the documentation? Like I was the worst. and he was like, you can just look at the source code. And that's when it clicked for me again. Because I'd been working like Visual Studios, not VS Code, but like Visual Studios, autocomplete, all, docs all linked to MD, like the whole, Microsoft developer network, that whole thing. And I'm coming back into open source and like, yeah, no, we just use Sublime here and all this kind of like thing. And it kind of reawoken something, because once he said, look at the source, I'm like, it's view source again. Like it's not the exact same, but then that just lit a fire for me. Like that's what I missed. I'd spent like years in the middle kind of just doing stuff like the way the corporation said to do it and following the steps, enterprise, here's how you package this up. And then I was like, oh, I can just look at the source, and I can change the source, and I can do all that. And he kind of empowered me. He was like, okay, we need to do better modular stuff. This VC stuff isn't working well. We should make components. We've just seen React. And I was like, okay, let's use web components. So we built a knockout web component thing. It's largely my work into web components that kind of, got us to that point. So when he left, I have to admit, I'd already kind of got my hands into it, but I was suddenly like very invested in open source.
Yeah. That's, it just clicked for me when you said that. It clicked for you that viewing source and like actually go in the libraries in open source projects and saying, you know what, I can figure this out, or I can figure out the bug, or we can figure out how we can extend this library. It's something that I don't think people use enough in engineering roles. Like I think we just sort of assume the library will work for us until it doesn't. And then we go either build or get another or install another one.
Yeah. Yeah. And once there, like the whole world of possibilities opens up. And for me, as I said, it started because he kind of nudged me a bit to like go, okay, well, let's do that web component thing. And then I actually ended up open sourcing my own web component library. And then I was like, oh, this doesn't work out. The right polyfills for the shadow DOM and all that stuff. And I started getting involved a little bit more in the community. Like I have to admit, my first PR was a disaster. Our shop was written all in CoffeeScript. And I
remember those days.
Used to doing CoffeeScript. I mean, in some ways, you felt like you're developing in the future. When I was using Knockout, I had like these function components, and it was all like CoffeeScript, and it was arrow functions and all this kind of stuff. And Knockout had these reactive primitives, and like we were doing like spreads and destructure and all this stuff. It felt like really advanced. But the problem was you also don't declare variables in Knockout. So another kind of known open source creator, Web Reflection, or Andre Giamacci, who created Hyper HTML, like one of the first template literal frameworks in terms of it's probably the first template literal framework in terms of rendering. He was doing a lot of web component polyfills, and I was like, oh, I want to do native built-ins extensions. I basically found something that I needed to extend on his plugin, his library, and I went to go make the PR for it. Or actually, I opened the issue, and then he's like, oh, someone can just make the PR. And I was like, okay, I'll make the PR. And like, it was a mess. Like I wasn't declaring, hadn't used JavaScript in years, and I like didn't declare my variables anywhere. And at the end, he was like, I very much appreciate the effort, but I decided to just implement it myself. Like I put a property on something. It's like, oh, you can use define property. Like there's like a whole bunch of like little details that I didn't know enough about, the specifics of JavaScript at the time, and like some subtle nuance that this was better. And
was that because the CoffeeScript experience?
A little bit. And honestly, you can get by with JavaScript not knowing JavaScript for a very long time. And I kind of, it was largely CoffeeScript, I have to say. But yeah, I didn't bother learning about like prototypes and learning about all that stuff because CoffeeScript just worked. And yeah, he rewrote it himself, and he just did it himself. And I looked at that to learn from it, but I felt a little bit embarrassed. But that didn't stop me. I just kept on making more library stuff. I made my custom element thing do more different libraries, like support Preact and like different frameworks over time, and not just Knockout. But Knockout was an interesting one because it was kind of left field. The whole industry kind of moved on from us when React came out, and I found myself in a very different place where everything I created or did was very different. Like I'd come and people would be like, look, this solution supports all frameworks with this web component thing. Skate.js, I think, was one of the ones from back in the day. And I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. And then I'd try to be like, oh, it doesn't work for us. Okay, that's fine. I kept on finding that agnostic solutions never worked for like the libraries and stuff I did, because Knockout as a reactive library was very, very different than what everyone else was doing.
Yeah, and you're right to say like the industry moved on because you had mentioned in passing like Ember.js as well that you were tinkering with. Like Ember.js was my first intro to JavaScript. Well, actually, jQuery was my first intro.
Yeah, me too.
Ember was my first like framework intro, and but yeah, as the industry glommed on the React, and like I shared the story a lot. Like when React came out, I remember distinctively sitting in the rail shop, and the front end dev was like, "Oh, Facebook is shipping a JavaScript framework," and like we all laughed.
Yeah.
And nowadays everyone's using this thing, and like everyone's using the primitives and the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, JSX was not taken very nicely at first, and everyone was so used to like the separation, the MVC kind of thing. But the thing is, I built large MVC or MVVM app, this one at the startup, and I saw some of the value there. The biggest problem we had with some of the technology at the time is that they didn't really give as much consideration for client-side state. I mean, the problem is like MVC on the server was a classic pattern, and we just brought it with us to the browser, and then suddenly it was like, where, like, controllers are singletons, like where do you get the state? And this was something that there's this problem with view models, and I'm getting a little bit technical on this. You'd either make your view model wrap the model or wrap the view. And it was not clear which way you should go. And you had people be like, oh, this is dry, you should do it this way. But then it would cause really bad coupling and all that. React's component model gave us a clear direction in terms of like where the state should live and how that should work. And every framework has followed toe. Even things as crazy as I mentioned, like Knockout, still ended up kind of going more this direction.
Yeah. So where did Solid come into this mix?
Well, it was right around that same time, right? I basically had taken over, and I was like, okay, I've inherited all these open source libraries. How can I like streamline it? Like we looked at React and we're like, this isn't how we do stuff. Like I really didn't like the class components. It reminded me of ASP.NET because there's all these life cycles, and I'd been really used to doing these primitives, like where you'd have like observable and computed and pure computed, and they're just like simple things where you could just call it as a function and essentially like describe your UI. You basically didn't need classes because you did everything in the constructor, so to speak. So, but these technologies were aging, and like aging kind of badly, because like React triggered a renaissance, like, bundlers and all this thing. And the performance was, maybe not as good as you wanted. And I was like, no, this approach has wings. So around 2015 and 16, I started experimenting. I'd already built my web component library, and I was like, I can build kind of a reactive library that can power my web components. And I kind of started on SolidJS at that point, and it wasn't really much. It was just my project I thought we'd use at work, and I built it on like in private on Bitbucket, and just kind of like tinkered away. And it was getting to a pretty good place, and I kind of liked the API and where I was sitting. And I kept coming across these benchmarks, and all the benchmarks. I watched a talk from Ryan Florence way back at like Hype.js where he did like a stock ticker like dbmod, and they kept on saying that this React approach of VDOM was fast and really fast. And I was like, no. I had some older demos, and I knew otherwise. And I was like, I can build a reactive system that can trump the VDOM on performance. And that's how it went, because I was just playing around with it, and I decided at that point I need to open source this because I want to enter benchmarks. It had nothing to do with anything else. I just wanted to show.
Just wanted to prove Ryan wrong.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I like. It wasn't just that. There was just like lots of different, all the whole rhetoric around like VDOM and performance. So I did, and I entered the JS framework benchmark. It was around 2018, so like we jumped ahead a couple years, but we had all the basics of what we had today. And the key innovation was something that I picked up from a different library, Surplus.js, was that we could use JSX with reactivity instead for our templates, and this could kind of like get us closer to JavaScript, and I really, really like that. So in 2018, JSX, reactivity, primitives, released this, entered some benchmarks, and I was pretty happy. I'd gone to basically the front of the list back then. So Solid was like the front of the JS framework benchmark. I guess it's like 4.5 years ago, and I was like, sweet, I've proven what I'm gonna do. And a few people saw it and like interested, so I started engaging, and like it was just kind of like my pet project. I didn't think very much of it, but I mean, another important milestone came up at that point, which was October 26, 2018. I remember these dates because this date changed my life, which is kind of sad to say, perhaps. But Dan Abramoff went on stage and announced React hooks. And this is a big date for me because Solid's primitives and React hooks look really similar. And at that point, he was legitimizing essentially this composable way of building things. And I didn't expect in a million years. Like I thought like, classes, everyone likes plain objects. They're not going to want to like create signal, things. And that changed everything. Because at that point I realized like there was a circle of us doing this kind of reactive programming, and we didn't think anyone would really care about what we were doing. And half of those libraries, when React hooks came out, they're just like, my work is done. And they just
like what libraries, what folks were
doing I think
reactivity?
I'm probably going to misname them right now because was it Moon? There's a couple JS libraries that really were talking about incredible performance. And I guess even Surplus itself had kind of run its course, the one that I got the influence from.
Yeah.
And, it was just kind of like, okay, we've done it. We've influenced people. This is a good pattern. And I was like, but wait, I understood the hook rules almost immediately. And I'm like, we don't need those. Like this could actually be like better in some ways. And at that point I was just like, okay, I'm going to start writing about like how I chose to go this way and how this framework works. And I got a Medium account and I started writing articles.
Yeah. So you came from a space where you're building this framework internally at this startup.
Yeah.
Which again, I honestly, if you're starting a startup and you want to build a business, starting a framework on top of that or to build that.
To be fair, it was mostly in my own time. It was the timing was kind of interesting because like I told you I was now in charge, which meant I didn't get to develop anymore. I need to hire people. And I was actually more of an engineering manager rather than like a developer anymore. So I was like, I had that itch. So I'd like come home after work and be like, okay, how can I make things more productive for my developers and stuff? So I'd actually start working on it in the evenings a bit. And at this point, I didn't have my kids yet, but actually right around that time, Solid's about as old as my oldest, my daughter, because, you start being up late at night when you have the newborn. And I was just like, okay, I'm up. So I actually was working on a Solid like in those years. Like the early years there.
And when my kid was born, I rewatched 30 Rock on Hulu. That's my productivity.
Right. So yeah, I just found the time kind of through that way. And as you said, it was for this startup, but it was actually my own project. And I tell people they find it amusing. In 2018, which is around the time I open sourced Solid, we had to make the decision whether we were going to make the switch. That old software had kind of ran its course, and they started talking about how hard it was to gut it. And I directed the team actually to Preact of all things.
Okay, so not even to Solid, but to Preact.
React, and we actually ended up on React. So ironically, like it was because the hooks and suspense and everything was really good patterns, and we really like that. And Solid wasn't where it needed to be yet, but having gone through the whole thing is like, startup, you guys don't need to take on this maintenance burden. In hindsight, it was probably a really good move for them because not only they were able to hire easier, which is a big thing that we always challenge with training, but I ended up moving on from that company like a year later. So like,
okay, because your job was done at that point,
right?
Yeah. So Solid now is a thing. It's open source 2018. You moved on to what company did you move on to?
eBay. Okay. Yeah. I told you I started writing, and I kind of made this claim, I guess, back in 2019 in one of my articles that basically components were pure overhead. That was kind of the concept I'd come up with because I'd built a framework for web components. And then at a certain point, I was like, why am I using the web components? And I just got rid of the web components. And what I was left with was a componentless framework, essentially. Like, don't get me wrong, Solid has components from an authoring standpoint, but the runtime, the components don't dictate anything. And so in a funny sense, web components have got me to build a framework, but then essentially then I kind of moved to a new zone. And once I was there, I realized that I could take this kind of fine-grained updates, and it was really performant, as I mentioned. And the eBay team saw that, and they're like, fine-grained to solve a different problem they're having. They were trying to figure out how to make their partial hydration, which is like islands, if people have seen that.
Yeah.
eBay's had islands like since 2014. Like they knew all about partial hydration. They've been developing these solutions for years and years. And they saw what I'd written about fine-grained and getting rid of components. And they're like, that's how we do even finer hydration. So I was suddenly working on Marko 6, the next version of Marko, which essentially takes kind of the fine-grained ideas from Solid and applies it to this compiler completely optimized for hydration. It's an incredible project, honestly.
So Marco's been around since 2014, or was it something before?
No, Marko was. That's when they open sourced it. They actually started in 2012. This is like an interesting story in itself, but I won't get too far into it. But essentially, eBay was all Java, and they're like, we want to do full stack Node. So they're like, we can only do that if we don't regress in performance. So create me a JavaScript framework that runs on the server that isn't going to cause like our metrics to go down. So Marko had to basically come up with partial hydration and streaming. And it's funny because these are two things that are very hot right now, because like React 18 brought streaming, and React Server Components are a form of partial hydration. Yeah. But Marko basically had that in 2014.
Yeah, and like I didn't even know what Marko was until recently. So it's just like mind-boggling for me as just like a JavaScript dev that's also doing React.
It's open source too. It was open source. It was just one of those things that no one cared at the point. Yeah. And they come and try and tell you about it. And then first question is like, where's your client-side router? Where's React router? And it's like, no. It's a multi-page app framework. Oh, we don't like multi-page apps. Like, and it's funny, we're seeing like a renaissance of that. It's things like Astro, Fresh. Yeah. But so yeah, Marko was like, I don't know, 8-10 years ahead of its time.
It's completely fascinating. Cause like, honestly, I feel like in San Francisco, I've been working here for years. Has not crossed Marko's path until like 2020 maybe. Yeah. And to find out today it's been around since 2014, like wow, okay.
Yeah, I joined the team in 2020, and that's when I like started kicking it up, because what had happened was the team had kind of slowed down a bit and just was managing eBay internally, and the creator had moved on, and the two guys were doing all of Marko basically. And I joined the team and I was like, how does no one know about this? Like it was so insane. Like I had one of those moments, like because like when I saw reactivity, I was like, and knockout, and years later I was like, this is an incredible thing. I was like, we should have been doing this for years. Marko was the same thing. It was like the second time in short order that I realized that I'd found something that was so incredibly ahead of its time. And I was like, we got to learn from this. So yeah, Marko was incredible. We're still working on Marko 6. It's an incredibly complicated compiler. It's subcomponent partial hydration. It's resumable. It's all the hydration bells and whistles. But for me personally, some other opportunities came knocking on the door for Solid, and that's kind of why I don't work at eBay anymore, because I love what I was doing at eBay.
Yeah, it's crazy because like you came from doing Knockout to then doing React briefly to now doing Marko to now you get to work on Solid full time. So like eBay moved you down to the Bay Area. Yeah. During the pandemic.
Yes.
So we had like in the very beginning, you're now working remote, open source for eBay, but then now. The opportunity was Netlify reached out?
Yeah. I'd been working for eBay for a couple of years, and honestly, I really wanted to see Marko 6 out the door. We're getting so close. It's such an amazing project. But then the opportunity was posed to me that I was already doing open source with eBay, but I could actually work fully on upstream open source, kind of like independent of the company's desires or whatever, to just kind of like just do what I do out in the community. And I thought that was just amazing. Like, to be fair, when you work on a company, open source project, whether you're eBay with Marko or Meta with React, like the company has needs, and that prioritization kind of comes into it. And you're like, okay, what's good for the company, we can also see that it's also good for others, and we'll trickle down and we'll make it happen. But this was a different kind of opportunity, because it was just like, let's talk about what you want to do, Ryan, and see what you can do with it. Because like Netlify's biggest thing is they want you to get your site out there. That's their biggest goal, is they just want to make it as easy as possible for anyone to just be out there on the internet and be able to, make their site. And these goals, with open source, obviously very run in parallel, but they're not like dictating each other. It's just like if I do good work in open source, that'll get more people building on the web, and then the more people can deploy Netlify. Like they sit together very cohesively, it's been incredible.
Yeah, and it's the thing that so I had this conversation a while ago with one of the open source employees on this channel on YouTube about Fang. Like the Fang conglomerate of all these public companies ruining open source. Because like when they get to the level of like principal where you're at a Google, you end up needing to, or distinguish is like the highest level. Yeah. You have to start driving business goals, and you have to start architecting like things that will make eBay faster and make Google search faster. And which is pretty adamant. Like it's admirable for Netlify to do that and reach out and say, hey, we just want to make it easier for people to get sites, whether it's Solid or React or Svelte or whatever it is. Like they just want to make it easier. So your role has no OKRs around like how many Solid deploys are.
No. Yeah. And the thing is, it was pretty open. Like the degree I work on Solid is actually up to debate, to a certain degree. Like obviously I have a lot of good work going on with Solid, but I work a lot with the other libraries a lot. Like I mean, we've been working on some benchmarks recently because hydration is one of those topics that is hard. People don't know the difference between the different approaches, but there is a big impact on your JavaScript. So we're going, okay, well, how do we measure it? How do we show that to people? So I've been working with closely with the guys from Builder and Quick and Marco, how to do that. And I just have this kind of opportunity to kind of, get that out there. Because here's the thing, you are right about the large company thing, like their priorities. But sometimes when you have stuff at that scale, there's good ideas that do trickle down. Like Marco obviously was built because of an eBay need. And now we have partial hydration and out of order streaming. And similarly, Quick, for example, is based on Wiz, which was an internal framework for Google. And their way of doing this kind of fine lazy loading kind of stuff has now gets to the mainstream where other people can leverage that. It takes a whole different type of effort to figure out how to take this incredible technology and make it usable by the masses. And that's kind of where it is. It's funny because I am a performance junkie. I love thinking about how you can maximize user experience. But so much of our work is actually about developer experience because it's like, it's pointless if it's hard to use. So there's always that kind of consideration.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I don't know if you've drawn this correlation because we talked about your engineering ring, and like also the name Solid, but like the fact that like again Solid's like removed a component and it's like really focused on this performance piece. So like you're working on a very specific piece and now it's trickling out to all these other frameworks. Like you're literally living the vision of all Canadian engineers of like you can make the web better and easier to use. Like, I don't know if you've thought about that.
I mean, it's crazy. I mean, you're right. Signals are coming everywhere now. Preact just released signals. Quick announced signals. The Angular team has been engaging me about how they can use signals. It's been crazy to see that, there are other options from the VDOM. We did see a bit that with Rich Harris and Svelte with the compiler, but this is like a different approach. And I never expected this at the beginning. I just wrote a framework, then wrote some articles, and here we are.
Yeah. And we barely didn't get a chance to cover your live streaming or YouTube. Like the purpose for that was really just to expose these concepts and get people engaged.
Yeah. I mean, I was not on social until 2019. I joined Twitter because someone said, hey, there's a cool demo. You should make an install to show people what you can do. And I joined at that point. It's like Paul Henschel 3D Cube demo. And at that point, whole new world. Like I wouldn't have actually got hired at eBay because they actually reached out to me through Twitter. I think that's what reminded them of my articles. And yeah, from there, it's just like, I knew that I'd get into debates with people like how you could analyze JSX and stuff. And it was just kind of, I couldn't break through on it. And it wasn't just about Solid. It was just about the kind of things that I'd learned in my journey. And I realized I needed to double down on my focus on content and education. So I started writing more articles, not just about Solid, just web dev in general, hydration, all these kind of topics that are very close to the framework and considered kind of advanced, and seeing if I could break them down in a way that more people could learn about these topics, because they are part of our trade. Like they are part of what we do. And it also helps, in my way, fight things like JavaScript fatigue, because if you have the education out there, you're not going to get blindsided by whatever new thing comes around, because nothing is really that new. It's like,
yeah, apparently, like with Marco being 2014, like you ripping Solid out of the sort of ashes of Knockout, yeah. Like it is very true. And like even like I mentioned React being, before we hit record, like it feels like PHP, JSX, and all this other stuff is borrowed from other places.
Yeah, exactly. And this continues to go on. And I think it's a good thing. People are like, oh, another JavaScript framework. I'm like, thank you. Like I like seeing where this innovation goes, but the key part is to understand the trends. You have to educate yourself and you have to learn about what those trends are. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to keep on going. And I wrote more general articles and I start streaming. It started as just like a casual Friday night stream because, that's when I had time for it. But I've had a chance now to actually put other framework authors on, out there, give them the podium to talk about, some of the more technical stuff, because sometimes you don't get to do that. People are just like, how do I use this? There's certain kind of lower bar on entry. And I get it. It's important to have adoption, to have people come in and be able to use your tool and use your framework. But, there's also a whole audience of people out there who are probably interested in what went into those decisions, kind of slightly more intermediate to advanced. And I realized pretty quickly that having those people on my show, so to speak, and talking with them, we could all learn things. It helped influence how Solid's meta framework, Solid Start worked. Just simply having like Nuxt and having Hydrogen and having like Marco and Quick and all those people come and talk to me about this. I use this as a chance to learn myself. This is I've been getting busier and busier with as things gone on, and I love actually having that space now, because it's like, okay, I'm gonna get to learn about something new today.
Yeah, cool. Well, I wish we could talk more, but we got to wrap it up. Would folks definitely should follow you on Twitter, follow you on Twitch. And YouTube, actually.
YouTube.
Yeah, a lot of your content's on YouTube. And just want to thank you for making the drive down. And stay saucy, y'all.